By the time the receptionist looked up from the admission screen, my contraction was already tearing through my back, and my mother was leaning across the hospital desk telling a stranger that my sister would be making decisions for my baby. The labor floor was bright, cold, and full of witnesses. A man near the vending machine stopped with his coffee halfway to his mouth. A woman holding a toddler looked up from her phone. Behind the counter, the receptionist froze with her fingers above the keyboard, caught between the chart in front of her and the woman standing in a hospital gown with one hand pressed against the desk. My mother never raised her voice when she wanted to do the most damage. "There seems to be some confusion," she said smoothly. "Naomi is not in a condition to handle this. Her sister, Tessa, will take over the baby's paperwork." My sister stood beside her in a cream sweater, quiet and composed, as if this had already been settled somewhere else and we were only there to complete the formalities. I let the contraction pass before I spoke. "Why is my sister speaking for my child?" The receptionist glanced at the screen. "There's a note here saying the support contact and newborn discharge coordination were updated last night." Last night. I had spent last night folding onesies into my hospital bag and checking the car seat straps twice in the dark because there was no one else to do it. While I was getting ready to bring my son into the world, someone had been preparing to receive him in my place. Tessa gave me a patient look I had hated since childhood. "No one is taking anything from you. Mom just thought it would be better if someone steady handled things." My mother placed her hand flat on the counter, wedding band bright under the lobby lights. "You've had a difficult pregnancy. We all agreed this was safest. We all agreed." It was the kind of sentence designed to turn a woman into a problem before she could answer for herself. Not unstable. Not incapable. Just close enough to both that the room would do the work. I straightened, even as another contraction tightened around my spine. "My name is Naomi Vega. I am the patient. I am the baby's mother. And I did not authorize my sister to make decisions for my child." The room went still. The receptionist looked at me differently after that. Less like a tired woman in labor. More like the only person in the room who should have been speaking from the start. She picked up the desk phone and called the charge nurse. My mother's jaw hardened for half a second, then relaxed. She had expected panic, tears, confusion, something she could use. What she got instead was a formal dispute in a hospital system that kept records. When the charge nurse arrived, she asked one question first. "Mrs. Vega, did you personally request this change?" "No," my mother answered over me. "She may not remember clearly." The nurse turned to her with flat professional calm. "I'm not asking you." That landed harder than shouting would have. The nurse reviewed the note on the account, then looked back at me. "This says newborn discharge coordination was reassigned to Tessa Mercer at 8:42 p.m. yesterday." A cold feeling moved through me then, sharper than fear because it had shape. This was not about comforting me through labor. It was about control at the exact administrative point where a newborn leaves the hospital and enters the world attached to someone's authority. "I was not here last night," I said. "And I did not make that request." The nurse flagged the account immediately. No third-party access. No discharge changes. No updates without direct patient verification. My mother finally lost the softness in her voice. "This is absurd." The nurse did not look at her. "What would be absurd is allowing someone to alter a laboring patient's newborn instructions without verified consent." That was when I stopped seeing it as cruelty and started seeing it as planning. Tessa still had not denied knowing about it. I asked for a copy of the authorization screen. My mother asked why I would need one now. I looked at her and said, "Because someone started preparing to take my child before I was even admitted." No one in the lobby moved after that. The nurse handed me the printout. At the bottom was the timestamp, the update code, and the field showing the change had come through a remote authorization queue. Not bedside. Not in person. Someone had used my name from outside the room. As they led me through the locked labor doors, another contraction forced me to stop and grip the wall. Behind me, I heard the nurse ask the receptionist who had verified the callback number on the change request. I did not hear the answer. I only turned enough to see my sister close her eyes for one brief second. That was enough. By the time the door shut behind me, I knew this much. My mother had not acted alone. My sister had expected the hospital to honor it, and whatever they had set in motion had begun before labor. Before the pain, before the witnesses, before I had the chance to protect my son in person. By the time the nurse clipped my ID band again inside labor and delivery, the public humiliation at the desk had already hardened into something more useful. A record. The room they admitted me to was narrow, bright, and overcooled. A monitor hummed beside the bed. Another contraction rose, slower this time but deeper, and I let the nurse settle the blood pressure cuff around my arm before I asked for the printout I had taken from admissions. She tucked it under the plastic basin on the side table so it would not get lost when they changed my gown. That small act mattered to me more than it should have. Nothing dramatic. Just a piece of paper left where I could still reach it. The charge nurse Dana came in a few minutes later with a tablet and shut the door behind her. "Your account is locked down," she said. "No one outside direct staff gets updates without your verbal authorization. No one is added to newborn discharge or medical communication unless you confirm it in person." I nodded once. Was there a message attached to the request? There was a note that said family approved change due to patient distress. Family approved. Another contraction cut through me. I gripped the rail, breathed through it, and waited until my voice was steady again. That language wasn't random. Dana watched me carefully. "You think this was planned?" "Yes, not because I was guessing, because I knew my mother too well. She never moved without preloading the story. If she wanted to take something, she prepared a version of events where keeping it from me looked responsible. Dana did not offer comfort. She offered precision, which was better. Health information is reviewing the source of the request. It came through the remote communications queue. That means someone used identifiers tied to your chart. My mother knows all of them, I said. My sister knows the rest. Dana made a note. Do either of them have portal access? No. But as soon as I said it, I knew that answer was too simple. My mother had never needed passwords if she could get people to believe she belonged somewhere. A phone call in the right tone, a birthday, an address, my insurance carrier, the last 4 digits of something old. She collected practical details the way other women collected recipes. Dana asked one more question. Do you want them removed from the visitor list entirely? The contraction that came then was strong enough to bend me forward. When it passed, I stayed quiet for a moment. Not from uncertainty, but because the right answer had shifted. An hour earlier, I would have said yes. Now I said, not yet. Dana's expression changed only slightly, but enough to show she understood I was no longer reacting. I was measuring. If you remove them now, I said, they change tactics. They start calling relatives. They start building concern. I want them close enough to keep moving. Dana held my gaze for a beat, then nodded. All right. But they don't get access to anything. If they come up, staff will treat them as visitors only. That was the first sign the structure was turning in my favor. Not emotionally. Operationally. Once she left, the room went quiet again, except for the monitor and the muted shuffle of shoes in the corridor. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the printout. Timestamp. Remote queue. Updated newborn discharge coordination. It was already enough to prove someone had acted before I arrived. But the real value was elsewhere. It showed intention, not a family argument. Not overprotection. Not a misunderstanding in the middle of labor. Someone had tried to insert my sister into the legal administrative path around my child before I reached the hospital. That was deliberate betrayal, and deliberate betrayal usually leaves a trail. A younger nurse named Pilar came in to place the fetal monitor and ask the routine questions. When she got to emergency contact, she paused. Who should we list now? I gave her one name. Marisol Kent. Not family. Not blood. My attorney. Pilar looked up. Relationship? Legal counsel. She did not react beyond typing it in, but the room itself seemed to settle after that. A different kind of witness had entered the story. Even on a screen, Marisol had handled my housing purchase 18 months earlier, then the custody filings and guardianship language I had insisted on during my 3rd trimester. When it became clear that my mother's version of help was really access. We had never needed to activate any of it. Until now. I called her between contractions. She answered on the second ring. Naomi? At admissions, I said. My mother tried to assign newborn discharge and medical communication to Tessa. Hospital flagged it. I have the time-stamped printout. Silence. Then the sound of a chair moving back hard. Did they say how it was submitted? Remote authorization queue. Last night. Good, she said. And the word was so coldly precise it steadied me. Not good for you. Good for proof. Listen carefully. Do not argue with them. Do not explain anything. Ask the hospital to preserve all communications tied to your chart from the last 72 hours, including call logs, portal notes, callback verification, and staff initials. I repeated the list to her while Pilar adjusted the monitor straps across my belly. Marisol continued. And Naomi? Yes. If they try to frame this as concern, that helps us. Concern doesn't falsify identity channels. That was why I had hired her. She never rushed to outrage when structure would do more damage. After the call, I asked Dana to preserve the records exactly as Marisol instructed. She agreed immediately and added hospital compliance to the chain. That, more than anything, told me the situation had already crossed out of family territory and into institutional risk. My mother had misjudged the room. She thought labor would make me smaller. In fact, it had placed me inside a system with logs, verification layers, and staff who did not care about family mythology. An hour later, Tessa texted me. Mom was only trying to help. You made this ugly for no reason. I read it once and set the phone down. 3 minutes later, another message came. You're exhausted and everyone knows it. Don't start something you can't finish. That one told me what I needed. Not apology. Not confusion. Pressure. She was not afraid I had been hurt. She was afraid I had understood. I took screenshots and sent them to Marisol without replying. Then I looked at the bassinet parked beside the wall, empty and waiting, with its folded striped blanket and transparent cradle card. Nothing dramatic happened for a few minutes after that. Pilar checked dilation. A machine beeped softly. Someone laughed far down the corridor. In another room, another family was probably crying for the right reasons. I sat there with one hand over the curve of my stomach and realized the ugliest part was not what my mother had done in public. It was that they had chosen this morning because they believed pain would keep me compliant. They had waited for the exact hour my body would be busy doing one irreversible thing, and they had tried to use that window to move another. That kind of timing does not happen by accident. When Dana came back in, she told me that Lorraine and Tessa were asking whether they could come up. I asked, what did they say exactly? Dana checked her notes. Your mother said you were frightened and may not be making clear decisions. Your sister said she needed to help manage your paperwork before the baby arrived. There it was again. Not love. Management. I let the contraction pass before answering. Let them wait. Dana gave a small nod and left. That was my first controlled choice of the day that had nothing to do with pain tolerance and everything to do with leverage. I wanted them outside the door, uncertain, forced to keep performing concern for staff who now had reason to doubt them. Waiting is a form of exposure when people are used to immediate access. I picked up the printout again and read the line at the bottom one more time. Family-approved change due to patient distress. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. They had reduced motherhood to a handoff and wrapped it in administrative language. But now that phrase belonged to the record, not to them. By the end of the second hour, my contractions were closer. My attorney had the screenshots. The hospital had initiated a preservation hold, and my mother was still outside trying to sound reasonable to people who had begun writing her down. That was the first sign it had been planned. The second was simpler. When my phone lit again, it was not my mother this time. It was my Aunt Celia. Your mom said Tessa has to step in because you signed something last week. Is that true? I stared at the message until the next contraction forced my eyes shut. No, I typed back when I could breathe again. I signed nothing. Her reply came almost instantly. That's not what Lorraine's been telling people. I set the phone down very carefully after that, because now I knew the hospital request had not been an isolated attempt. They had started laying the story outside the building, too. By the time compliance came into my room, my mother's lie had already moved beyond the admissions desk. That mattered more than the false hospital request itself. A forged update could be blocked. A story planted early in the right ears could keep spreading long after the system corrected it. I was deep enough into labor that every question had to be timed between contractions when Ruth Halpern from compliance arrived with a health information officer and Dana standing beside them. The officer placed a printed call log on my tray table and pointed to the entry from the night before. The request came in at 8:40. 2 p.m., he said. A callback verification was completed at 8:49 to the number on file ending in 1186. I knew that number immediately. It had been mine years ago, before I changed carriers and let the old line die. My mother still had it written in one of her address books. Not a hack, not a breach. Something uglier and simpler. She had used old personal information and enough confidence to sound legitimate. Ruth asked whether that number was still mine. I said no. She asked whether anyone in my family would know it. I said my mother would, and possibly my sister. Then the officer added something worse. 21 minutes before the callback, someone had sent a portal inquiry asking whether a family proxy could update newborn discharge instructions if the patient was under medical strain. The phrase hit me harder than the contraction building in my spine. It was too polished to be spontaneous. Someone had tested the language before making the move. When Ruth asked whether anyone else had ever used my phone for hospital messaging, I knew exactly when it had happened. Early in the pregnancy, when I was sick enough that my mother insisted on helping with appointment messages from my kitchen table. At the time, it had looked practical. Now it looked like setup. The officer scrolled again. There's also a callback note saying the caller referenced a prior anxiety episode and confirmed a family support plan. I stared at him. I never had a family support plan on file, and I do not have an anxiety diagnosis. That was the first clean proof this had been deliberate. Not concern. Not family overreach. Someone had inserted clinical-sounding language about my stability to make it easier to shift authority over my child. Ruth printed the note for me. Patient under increased distress. Sister authorized to assist. Family aware of instability concerns. Will verify discharge coordination with older daughter if labor progresses rapidly. Older daughter, not the mother. Not me. Just the daughter my mother wanted in control. Before I could even respond, my phone buzzed. My Aunt Celia had texted again. Your mother told the family you had a panic incident and asked Tessa to step in. She said the hospital already approved it. I handed the phone to Ruth. She photographed both messages for the review file without comment. That was the second layer. My mother had not only tried to alter the hospital record, she had started briefing the family before I was even admitted upstairs. So if the hospital stopped her, she could still claim she had been protecting the baby from me. Then Tessa texted, "You're making this bigger because you want an audience. Mom wouldn't do this without reason." I screenshotted it and sent it to Marisol. That message mattered for one reason. My sister did not deny what happened. She defended it. When the room finally went quiet again, the proof had edges now. A dead phone number from my old records. A familiar device used for portal contact. A false note about instability. Family messages spreading the same story outside the hospital. A sister protecting the setup instead of calling it a mistake. Each piece was small on its own. Together, they formed intent. Dana returned a little later and told me my mother was still downstairs, telling staff I was frightened and not understanding what was happening. I told Dana to let her wait and to document every request. It already is, she said. That answer steadied me more than comfort would have. Then my phone lit up one more time. This one was from my mother. I never wanted it to happen this way. But if you force people to protect a child from you, don't blame them for doing it. I sent it straight to Marisol with one line of my own. They are building an unfit mother narrative in real time. Her reply came back almost immediately. Good. Let them build it in writing. I set the phone down and looked at the monitor, tracing my son's heartbeat. For the first time that morning, I was no longer just absorbing what they had done. I was watching it become dangerous for them. By the time my doctor confirmed I was close to transition, the betrayal had stopped looking personal and started looking structural. That was the part my mother never understood. She believed power lived in tone, in appearances, in who spoke first and who sounded most certain. But hospitals, banks, property offices, and courts do not ultimately care who sounds like the parent in charge. They care who is named, who is authorized, who can be verified, and who leaves a trail when they try to move something that does not belong to them. Marisol arrived before noon. She did not rush into the room like a friend. She entered like a woman who had already sorted the facts into categories that could survive daylight. Dark coat folded over one arm, legal pad in hand, hair pinned back. She took in the printouts, the monitor, the half-finished cup of melting ice on my tray, and the contraction timer on the screen before she said a word. "Tell me only what can be documented," she said. So I did. Not how it felt. Not what my mother had always been like. Only the parts that could stand on their own. The admission statement, the unauthorized discharge update, the dead phone number used for callback, the portal inquiry about a family proxy under medical strain, the false note about instability, the text from my aunt, the text from Tessa, and my mother's last message. Marisol arranged the papers in a line across the tray table between contractions. "This is not just interference," she said. "This is an attempted transfer of decision-making authority at the point of newborn discharge, supported by a false capacity narrative." Hearing it phrased that way changed the temperature in the room. Because that was what it had been all along, stripped of family language. Not help. Not concern. Not maternal panic. An attempted transfer of authority over my child at the most vulnerable administrative seam in the process. Dana stayed while Marisol reviewed the account protections already in place. No third-party communication. No discharge modification without in-person patient confirmation. Compliance hold on all notes and recordings. Visitor access restricted to observation only. No procedural discussion with anyone but me. Marisol nodded once. Good. Now we widen the wall. She asked Dana whether the hospital had a newborn security protocol tied to parent band matching and discharge verification. Dana said yes. Marisol asked for it to be flagged in writing. No infant release, no education sign-off, no transport handoff, no chart discussion, no wristband pairing changes, unless initiated directly by me. Dana left to handle it. When the door closed, Marisol turned to me. "There's more, isn't there?" I knew what she meant. The hospital request was ugly, but it had not appeared out of nowhere. It fit too cleanly with the pressure of the last 6 weeks. The repeated offers for Tessa to help with nursery setup. My mother asking whether I had thought about temporary guardianship, in case recovery was difficult. Tessa insisting she would be better at routines because she was more structured. The push to keep a copy of my insurance card. The way my mother had asked, too casually, whether my condo title had been updated to reflect family contingency planning once the baby arrived. At the time, each move had looked separate. Pushy. Controlling. Familiar. Now they locked together. I told Marisol about the condo. Not because the property itself mattered more than my son, but because my mother never pursued only one form of control at a time. If she was preparing to position Tessa around the baby, she had likely been preparing the house as well. Housing. Access. Routine. Dependency. That was how family takeovers worked when they wanted to look respectable. They did not start by stealing the child. They started by surrounding the mother. Marisol wrote down one address and one phrase. Title status. "I want a title pull by end of day," she said. "And I want to know whether your mother or sister has used your address for mail, school inquiries, medical forms, or emergency contact anywhere. When people build authority, they usually build it in layers." That was exactly right. Layers. The hospital was only the layer we had caught in time. Another contraction bent me forward over the bed rail. Marisol stopped speaking until I finished breathing through it. She never once told me to calm down. She assumed I already was. When I could speak again, I asked the question that had been forming since admissions. If they had gotten away with it this morning, What would it have looked like? Marisol did not soften the answer. Your sister would not have become the legal mother, but she could have been treated, in that first critical window, as the competent coordinating adult around the baby. She could have received instructions, been looped into discharge procedures, positioned herself for follow-up claims, and created a paper impression that your family had already stepped in because you were unstable. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because it was new, because it was exact. That was what made the whole thing so poisonous. They had not needed to erase me fully. They only needed to reposition me for long enough that the system would start writing around me. Marisol continued. And once a false dependency story starts attaching itself to a mother in formal settings, it spreads. Pediatrician intake, emergency contacts, caregiver assumptions, school paperwork later, housing arguments. If nobody cuts it off early, people begin treating fiction as background fact. There it was, the structural reveal. Not a single cruel morning, but an architecture, the hospital note, the family messaging, the proxy language, the old identifiers, the concern narrative, the planned role for Tessa, none of it dramatic on its own. Together, it was a framework for control. Dana came back with 2 forms and a printed copy of the newborn release protocol. My name had been bolded on the parent verification line. Under special restrictions, someone had added, "No family proxy. Patient only." I read that line twice. No family proxy. It looked small on the page. It felt enormous. For the first time that day, the structure was not merely preserving evidence of what they had attempted. It was actively naming the boundary they could not cross. Marisol pointed to the form. That matters. Yes, I said, because now if they push again, they are not operating in a gray area. They are acting against a specific written restriction. That was the second turn of part 4. Money and systems rarely defeat people in one blow. They do it by converting a dispute into a boundary, then recording who ignores it. My phone buzzed while Dana reviewed the form with me. This time, it was a message from building management at my condo. Miss Vega, just confirming. Your mother requested a temporary access fob this morning, stating she may need to assist with post-delivery recovery. Please advise. I stared at the text long enough that Marisol took the phone from my hand and read it herself. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then she looked up. There it is. Same day. Same pattern. Same language of help. Not just the hospital. The house, too. My mother had tried to position herself around the place where I would recover with my son before labor had even finished. If the hospital move gave Tessa administrative presence around the baby, the condo access gave Lorraine physical presence in the home. Between them, they could have walked straight into the first week of my child's life as if they belonged there more than I did. Reply no, Marisol said. Then ask them to note in writing that no access is authorized to anyone but you. I did. A minute later, building management answered. Understood. Existing request denied, and account flagged. Denied and flagged. Another small administrative sentence that sounded colder than anger and did more damage. Marisol asked me to forward the exchange to her. Then she made one more call from the corner of the room, low-voiced and efficient. I knew she was speaking to the county recorder's office before she even turned back. Your condo title is unchanged, she said. Sole owner, no transfer filings, no lien activity, no power of attorney recorded. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. My mother had not touched the property itself. Not yet. But the request for access proved she had already begun positioning around it. She did not need to own the house to use it. She only needed enough presence to look indispensable inside it. That was always her method. She did not seize control in one obvious act. She entered under the banner of support and waited for exhaustion to do the rest. A nurse came in to adjust my IV line and check the baby's heart rate. The monitor stayed steady. Outside, a code cart rattled briefly down the hall, then disappeared. Inside the room, Marisol stacked the papers again and clipped them into a folder she had brought herself. Listen to me carefully, she said. This is no longer just about defending yourself. It's about preventing them from creating a false caregiving history. That means every point of access matters. Hospital discharge, home entry, pediatric follow-up, insurance communication, and any written claim that you ask them to step in. I nodded. Because she was right, and because part of me was already thinking ahead to ordinary things that should have remained simple. A first pediatric appointment, a prescription pickup, a delivery at the door, any place where one woman could say, "She needs me to handle this," and another overworked person might believe it. That was what they had been building toward. Not one kidnapping fantasy. Not one wild illegal act. A series of respectable little substitutions. I looked at the empty bassinet again. The folded blanket. The clear plastic card waiting for a name. My son was not even here yet, and already I understood the shape of the future they had prepared for me. Not absent, exactly. Just slowly pushed to the edge of my own motherhood while more capable people handled the practical parts. It would have looked clean from the outside. That was the worst part. Marisol followed my gaze. "You stop this now," she said. "Or you spend the next year correcting records and impressions." Another contraction came, sharper, lower, almost splitting my focus in two. I gripped the rail, breathed through it, and felt the force of it move through my spine and pelvis like something ancient and mechanical. When it passed, I stayed still for a few seconds, then opened my eyes. "Then we stop it now," I said. Marisol gave a short nod. "Good." Before leaving the room to take another call, she placed the folder beside my bed where I could see it. Evidence? Property confirmation? Denied access request? Hospital restrictions? Preserved messages? All of it gathering weight in one place. Outside the room, my mother was still trying to sound reasonable. Inside the room, the system had begun answering her with writing. By the time my labor crossed into the hard, stripped-down hours where the body takes over and pride becomes inefficient, I understood something I had not wanted to name all day. This had not started with the hospital. The hospital was only the first place their planning became visible to other people. Part of me had known it earlier and refused to organize it. Not because the signs were subtle. Because once I arranged them in order, they would stop being family habits and become intent. My mother had started coming by the condo more often around the start of my third trimester, always with something useful in her hands. Soup. Folded baby clothes. A list of pediatricians I had not asked for. She would set things down in my kitchen, and then stand still long enough for her eyes to travel. The bottle rack by the sink. The unopened stroller box by the wall. The nursery chair I had assembled myself. She never complimented anything directly. She assessed it. At the time, I thought she was doing what she had always done when she disapproved of a life she had not designed herself. Inspecting it until she found a weakness. Now I saw the pattern more clearly. She had not been looking for weakness. She had been mapping function. What had to be refilled? What would need lifting? Which cabinet held medicine? Where I kept spare keys? Which drawers were already labeled? She had been learning the mechanics of my home, the way someone studies a place they expect to move through later without being questioned. Tessa had played a different role. She arrived with softness. She asked whether I wanted her to help set up a feeding station in the bedroom. She said she could stay a few nights after delivery if I was worried about sleep. She sent me links to newborn schedules, then followed them with messages about how hard the first month could be for women doing too much alone. She never said incapable. She never needed to. She built the frame around the word and let me hear it on my own. The deeper moral ugliness was not that they thought I might struggle. Every new mother struggles. It was that they were preparing to use the normal difficulty of that first exhausted season as an opening to reposition themselves permanently inside it. I had one memory then that settled everything. 2 weeks earlier, my mother had stood in the nursery doorway while I was sorting diapers by size. She had picked up the small notebook where I had written feeding reminders, pediatric questions, and one-page emergency instructions for myself in case I got too tired to think clearly at 3 in the morning. She flipped through it once and smiled without warmth. "You always make things harder than they have to be," she said. "There's no shame in admitting some women are better at this kind of life than others." I had not answered. At the time, I thought she meant domestic life in the broad way she always did: marriage, routines, The endless invisible work she respected only when it was done by women she approved of. Now, in a hospital bed with her false instability note preserved in a compliance file, I knew exactly what she had meant. Not some women. Tessa. Not later. Soon. They had been preparing the moral case before they made the administrative move. Another contraction rolled through me, hard enough to drag my focus downward until all thought narrowed to breath and timing. When it passed, Marisol was still in the chair near the window, reviewing the printouts again, not because she needed to remember them, but because repetition belongs to systems too. Good ones make the same truth hold in multiple places. There's something else, I said. She looked up. They've been rehearsing the idea that I'd need help inside the house. Not casually, repeatedly. I gave her the examples in order. My mother asking whether I would really manage stairs alone with a newborn. Tessa suggesting that the baby spend some afternoons at her place so I could recover properly. My mother asking whether I had added anyone to emergency pickup lists yet. As if school forms for a child not yet born were normal dinner conversation. Tessa offering to keep copies of doctor instructions, so nothing gets missed. My mother saying more than once that exhausted women make dangerous decisions and good families step in before pride gets in the way. Marisol wrote down only the parts that mattered. Not concern, she said finally. Infrastructure. Yes, that was the word. They had not been comforting me toward birth. They had been constructing access points around it. The tragedy of family betrayal is rarely the moment people from the outside recognize. It is not always the public insult, or the signature, or the stolen object. Sometimes it is the discovery that kindness was being laid down like wiring inside your life weeks before the switch was flipped. A nurse came in to check me again and said quietly that I was nearly complete. She dimmed one bank of lights. Someone set out instruments on a tray. The room changed from waiting to preparation. For a few minutes, nothing happened except ordinary labor work. Peeler braided my hair back at my request because I did not want it sticking to my neck. Dana brought me water with a straw and asked one direct question. Do you still want no one from your family in the room? Yes. She nodded and left without comment. It was one of those short human scenes the world would never consider dramatic. A nurse braiding a laboring woman's hair. A cup of water. A dimmed light. But it hit me harder than the public scene downstairs had, because it revealed the contrast cleanly. Strangers were protecting the shape of my motherhood more carefully than my own family had. My phone buzzed on the tray beside me. A photo message from Tessa. It was my nursery shelf. The one above the changing table. I knew instantly when she had taken it. 3 days earlier, when my mother had come by with soup and Tessa had offered to carry a bag inside. Below the photo was one line. We were only trying to make sure everything was ready if you couldn't handle it. I stared at the message until the meaning settled into place. They had already been documenting the house. Not sentimentally. Operationally. If they needed to later, they could say they knew where everything was because they had been helping prepare. They could explain their familiarity with the apartment, the drawers, the supplies, the routines. They had been building normalcy around their presence before the baby was born. I sent the screenshot to Marisol. She read it once and put the phone face down on the tray. That helps us, she said. Because it proves access? Because it proves expectation. She was right. People do not photograph nursery shelves unless they imagine themselves using them. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one from my mother. If you had accepted support with grace, none of this would be happening in a hospital. That line might have hurt more in an earlier year of my life. Once, I would have spent hours dismantling it in my own head, asking whether independence had made me look ungrateful, whether boundaries had sounded like contempt, whether some quieter version of me could have prevented the scene. Not anymore, because the sentence did not contain regret. It contained doctrine. Accept control gracefully and it will not humiliate you in public. That was the family rule I had spent years circling without naming. The punishment was never only for disobedience. It was for refusing to make takeover feel like love. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded the message to Marisol and looked at the bassinet again. I thought then of one small thing waiting at home. A stack of newborn sleepers in the top drawer, folded by color, because I had laughed at myself for caring and done it anyway. Not because babies notice neatness. Because order had been my way of making room for tenderness. Of telling myself that his life would begin somewhere arranged by care, not chaos. My mother and sister had looked at those same drawers and seen systems to inherit. That was the deeper moral reveal. They were not trying to rescue me from collapse. They were preparing to convert my preparation into their authority, while I still trusted them enough to let them into the room. A doctor entered then, gloves already on, and the room narrowed into the next task. The bed shifted. The monitor changed rhythm. Dana moved to one side, Pilar to the other. Before the pushing started, Marisol stepped close enough for only me to hear. After he's born, nothing changes, she said. No discussion with them. No explanations. The record continues. I nodded, because by then I understood the full shape of what had been taken, and what had almost been taken. Not only the authority over discharge papers, not only access to the baby, not only the condo. Ha! They had been preparing to take authorship of my first days as his mother. And that, more than any money, document, or property, was the thing I would not let them touch. My son was born just after 2 in the afternoon. Red-faced, furious, and unmistakably mine. For a few minutes, nothing else mattered. Dana laid him against my chest, warm and damp and breathing in short, uneven pulls that slowly settled under my hand. Pilar adjusted the blanket around us. Someone checked my blood pressure. Someone else banded his tiny wrist and matched it to mine. I made them check the numbers again. Then a third time. No one argued. That was the first thing motherhood became after birth. Not softness, not relief, but precision. Because once someone has already tried to step between a woman and her child, even joy learns to keep records. When the room quieted, Marisol came back in and asked, "Do you want the update now?" I looked at my son sleeping in the bassinet beside me and said yes. "The intake recording is worse for them than we thought," she said. "The caller didn't speak as your mother. She identified herself as you." I held her gaze. "She used your name, your old callback number, and referred to a postpartum risk conversation that does not exist in your file." Marisol continued. "This is no longer family interference. It's impersonation tied to newborn discharge control." There it was. Clean. Cold. Final. My mother had not just pushed boundaries or exaggerated concern. She had impersonated me to move my sister into the administrative path around my child before labor. I folded the summary once and placed it under the hospital folder on my table. No speech. No reaction I could hand back to them. Just placement. A few minutes later, Dana knocked and stepped in. "Your mother and sister are at the nurse's station," she said. "They're demanding access to the baby. Security is already involved." Of course they were. "What exactly are they saying?" I asked. Dana checked her note. "Your mother says she is the acting family coordinator because you're exhausted and not making clear decisions after delivery. Your sister says you agreed before labor that she would help oversee discharge." Oversee. Agreed before labor. The lie was tightening, not loosening. Marisol looked at me. "Decide once. No visitors," I said. "And document the wording." Dana nodded. "Already done." Then she added, "Security also heard your mother say she needs to intervene before you sign discharge papers incorrectly." That helped more than it hurt, because by then the account had already been flagged. The chart locked, compliance involved, and written restrictions placed on newborn release. My mother was no longer operating in ambiguity. She was pushing directly against a documented boundary in front of staff and security. She was making herself useful to the record. While Marisol called hospital legal, I tried to feed my son for the first time. He latched badly, then better, then fell asleep against me with one hand open on my chest. Pilar returned with water and quietly moved the bassinet closer to my bed before leaving. Another small human kindness. Another reminder of who was actually protecting us. When I finally checked my phone, there were messages from my mother, Tessa, and my Aunt Celia. My mother. You've made a staff misunderstanding into a family scandal. Then, you are not thinking clearly after delivery. Anyone can see that. Security doesn't understand the situation. Fix it. And then, if you force this into legal territory, don't expect family to stand by you later. I sent them all to Marisol. Then I opened Celia's text. Your mother is telling people the hospital had concerns about your mental state and restricted family access because you became combative. Combative. That was the social escalation. When the hospital stopped giving her room, she moved outward, planting a version of events before facts could catch up. She was no longer trying only to reach my son. She was trying to shape the story around why she could not. Marisol read the message and said, "Good. Let her keep saying it." Then she showed me the formal notice she had drafted to hospital legal, compliance, and patient relations. It stated that Lorraine Mercer and Tessa Mercer had no authority to represent me, speak for me, receive information about my child, influence discharge, or assert incapacity on my behalf, and that any further attempt would be preserved for potential civil action. I read every line and approved it. 30 minutes later, Dana returned with the outcome. Security had removed my mother and sister from the labor and delivery floor after Lorraine refused to leave the nurse's station. Patient relations had also placed a no-contact flag on my room for the rest of my stay unless I revoked it in person. Removed. No contact. In writing. That was the real turn of Part 6. They escalated publicly, socially, and psychologically, and the structure answered them with exclusion they could not charm, shame, or pressure away. My mother still made one final move before evening. One last text. If this is how you want your son's first day to begin, remember that you chose it. I looked at the message for a long moment. Because that was always her method. Create the wound, then offer me responsibility for the bleeding. I did not answer. I turned off my phone, placed it face down on the tray, and lifted my son when he stirred. The room was dim by then. The hallway had gone quieter. Somewhere beyond the door, another baby cried, another cart rolled, another family moved through a normal day. Inside mine, no one from my family could enter without my permission. Outside, my mother was still trying to control the story. Inside, she had already lost control of the ground. The public collapse began the next morning during the discharge review, inside the exact process my mother had tried to reach before anyone else could shape it. By then I had slept in fragments, fed my son twice, and signed every routine form the nurses placed in front of me. Morning light came through the blinds in narrow bands and lay across the floor beside the bassinet. My son was asleep in his striped hospital shirt with one hand folded near his face, and the ordinariness of that scene mattered more than I expected. It meant the system was finally treating us the way it should have from the start, as a mother and her child moving through a normal hospital discharge, not as a family dispute waiting to be interpreted. Dana came in first with the discharge schedule, postpartum instructions, and the pediatric review. A social worker joined us a few minutes later. Then Ruth from compliance. When Dana asked whether I wanted my attorney present, I said yes. And Marisol arrived before the paperwork began. It should have been a simple meeting about feeding, warning signs, follow-up care, and the car seat release. Instead, it became the first formal setting in which my mother's version of events could not survive contact with the record. Ruth began by reading the hospital's findings from the incident review. She did not dramatize any of it. She spoke in the same even tone people use for lab results and policy notes, and that neutrality made the substance land harder. An unauthorized caller had impersonated me through the patient communication system. False statements about my emotional condition had been used to support proxy access. There had been an attempt to interfere with newborn discharge coordination, followed by repeated visitor pressure after written restrictions were already in place. No one interrupted her. The social worker looked down at the summary in front of her and then back at Ruth. The pediatric nurse, who had come in to complete my discharge teaching, stood still beside the counter with her pen in hand. Then the social worker asked the question that finally stripped the whole story down to its truth. She wanted to know whether there had ever been any actual clinical concern about my ability to care for my child or understand the discharge process. Ruth answered without hesitation that there had been none, and that every concern in the file had originated through unauthorized family representations rather than medical observation. That was the point where my mother's narrative broke in a way it could not be repaired. For nearly a day, she had been trying to force one idea into the room, into the waiting area, and out into the family. That I was too emotional, too unstable, too exhausted, or too fragile to be trusted with the first decisions around my own child. Now the hospital itself had identified the source of that claim, and it was not medicine, staff judgment, or any documented concern about me. It was my family. I did not add anything after that. I adjusted the blanket over my son's legs and let the record do the work. My mother had always believed that reality belonged to the person who spoke first and sounded most certain. In that room, reality belonged to the file. The next turn came when the unit supervisor brought in a copy of the complaint my mother had filed with patient relations that morning. Lorraine had claimed the hospital was excluding the designated family guardian from the child's discharge process, and she had signed the complaint herself. That signature closed the gap she had been trying to hide inside. Up to that point, she had still been shifting between roles depending on what served her best. Worried mother, concerned grandmother, practical adult, offended elder. The complaint fixed her in one position and attached her own name directly to the same false authority. The hospital had already traced to impersonation, fabricated instability language, and unauthorized proxy interference. Marisol asked whether my mother had also claimed that I agreed to the arrangement. The supervisor said yes. Ruth placed the complaint beside the incident summary, then added the screenshots of Tessa's messages, defending what had happened and pressuring me to stop making it bigger. The documents did not contradict each other. They reinforced one another. The complaint showed that my mother was still trying to formalize the role she had failed to secure through the hospital system, and my sister's messages showed that she was not confused by the setup, but invested in it continuing. The pediatric nurse looked from one page to the next and said quietly that it sounded as though they had expected to be part of the discharge plan before the baby was even born. Marisol answered that they had, and that they had tried to create that role by making the mother sound temporarily unfit. No one in the room treated that explanation as an exaggeration. That mattered more than anger would have. In family conflicts, people often survive by hiding inside tone. They count on outsiders to hear stress, overprotectiveness, old tension, and call the whole thing complicated. But once a pattern shows itself across formal records, written complaints, and preserved messages, complication begins to disappear. What remains is design. The hospital was not the only place where that design had surfaced. While Ruth was finishing her notes, Marisol received the forwarded email from my condo building manager with my mother's original access request attached. Lorraine had described herself in writing as the primary support adult managing postnatal recovery in the home, and had asked whether a long-term guest parking pass could also be issued for Tessa to assist with infant care. Logistics. When Marisol handed me the phone, I read the request once and gave it back. The social worker's expression changed first, and then the pediatric nurse lowered her eyes to the table for a moment, as if she preferred not to let her reaction show too openly. Neither woman needed the significance explained. The same caregiving narrative my mother had tried to force into the hospital had already been extended toward my home. She had not been reacting to a difficult labor or a moment of confusion. She had been establishing authority across multiple systems at the same time. Marisol said exactly that. She explained that the hospital request and the home entry request relied on the same premise. That I would be too compromised in the early days after birth to manage my own child, my own recovery, and my own home without them stepping in. The unit supervisor wrote that down immediately. That was the point where the collapse stopped being private and became institutional. It was no longer my word against my mother's style, or my memory against her confidence. The hospital had flagged impersonation and proxy interference. My building had denied an access request built on the same false caregiving frame. My sister's messages showed expectation rather than surprise. My mother's signed complaint proved she was still pressing the claim even after being stopped. Dana stepped out briefly to confirm final discharge timing and returned with one more piece that pushed the matter further. Security had completed its incident note from the nurse's station. According to the report, my mother had told staff that I was fragile, dependent, and likely to sign the wrong things if left alone. The social worker looked up at that line and I could see in her face that she understood it for exactly what it was. It was not maternal fear. It was not concern expressed badly. It was an attempt to downgrade one adult woman in order to redirect authority around her child. Ruth added the security note to the file, and with that the whole architecture stood exposed at once. Impersonation, false instability claims, parallel access positioning, written complaints, and public pressure on staff after restrictions had already been explained. My son stirred then and made a small restless sound, so I touched his stomach through the blanket until he settled again. That tiny movement changed the feeling in the room more than any argument could have done, because it returned everything to its proper center. This was not a conflict about family pride or personality. It was about a mother, her child, and a deliberate attempt to separate the two by administrative means, while still making it look respectable. The final turn came just after the discharge nurse finished reviewing the paperwork with me. Dana stepped back into the room and said, in the same calm voice she used for medication instructions and chart updates, that patient relations had closed Lorraine Mercer's complaint as unfounded. The hospital was barring both Lorraine and Tessa from further contact with labor and delivery, mother-baby, and newborn records, and the impersonation matter was being referred to legal. No one reacted theatrically. There was no speech, no gasp, and no moment that would have looked satisfying from the outside. The collapse was quieter than that, but far more permanent. My mother had come into the hospital expecting confidence, family status, and practiced concern to carry her through. Instead, she left behind a documented impersonation trail, a rejected complaint, a security report, a no-contact restriction, and a legal referral that would not disappear because she changed her tone. That was the social collapse in its clearest form. The authority she relied on inside family spaces did not survive contact with neutral systems. The people she expected to defer to her had stopped doing so. Her narrative was no longer being repeated as concern. It was being recorded as interference. The financial consequences were only beginning to take shape, but they were already there in outline. Civil exposure, legal review, and written evidence across multiple systems all carry cost, whether through counsel, liability, or the loss of control she had been trying to secure. She had attempted to gain power through access and paperwork. Now access and paperwork were turning against her. The emotional shift arrived in a smaller, more human way. When Dana handed me the final discharge form, she paused and told me I was doing well. She did not say it like comfort. She said it like a fact, not a woman barely holding herself together, not a patient others needed to manage. Just a mother doing well. I signed my name where they had tried to route around it, Naomi Vega. Then I initialed the newborn release line, adjusted my son's blanket once more, and watched the nurse place the completed paperwork back into the chart. In the end, my mother did not lose because I argued more forcefully than she did. She lost because the structure stopped bending, and once it did, every move she had made became visible at the same time. By the time they wheeled us downstairs, I was no longer thinking about what my mother had tried to take. I was thinking about what would never be available to her again. The afternoon light outside the hospital had gone soft and pale. Dana walked beside me with the discharge folder balanced on the blanket over my lap, and my son slept in my arms with the deep, careless sleep only newborns have. At the entrance, a volunteer held the door. The automatic glass opened, and for one ordinary second it felt as though the world had agreed to become simple again. Then I saw my Aunt Celia standing near the curb. Not my mother. Not Tessa. Just Celia, coat unbuttoned, purse hanging loose from one shoulder, as if she had come in a hurry, and then stopped herself from rushing closer. She looked at the baby first, then at me. Lorraine told everyone you weren't allowing family near him because the hospital sided with you before hearing the whole story, she said quietly. I shifted my son slightly higher against my chest and waited. Celia's eyes moved to the folder in Dana's hand. Then patient relations called me back, she added. They said they couldn't discuss details, but they made it very clear your mother is not to contact the unit again. That was all she needed to understand. Not the audio summary, not the compliance notes, not the complaint file. Just the tone of an institution drawing a line around a woman who had spent her whole life assuming lines were for other people. Celia looked ashamed, though the shame was not hers. Your mother told people you were fragile, she said. Then this morning she said you were vindictive. By lunch, she was saying the hospital had overreacted. Tessa keeps telling people it was a misunderstanding. I almost smiled at that. The story was already shrinking under its own contradictions. Dana helped settle my son into the car seat and checked the straps once more before stepping back. She wished me well, then handed me the folder. My name was printed on the front label. So was my son's. No proxy language, no family coordinator, no secondary authority waiting in the margins. Just us. Celia stood beside the car while I got in. She did not ask to hold him. She did not ask for forgiveness on anyone's behalf. She only said, I think your mother believed that if she moved early enough, everyone would treat it as help. She always does, I said. Celia nodded once. This time people saw it. That was the real ending, not punishment, not vindication, recognition. When I got home, the condo was exactly as I had left it, and that mattered more than I can explain. The nursery door was half open. The folded blankets were still on the shelf. The feeding notebook was still on the dresser where I had left it. The apartment had not been entered, adjusted, or prepared around me by someone calling it love. I carried my son into the nursery and set him down in the bassinet beside the chair. For a few minutes, I did nothing except stand there and listen to him breathe. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the soft hum of the air vent and the faint traffic below the windows. Then I opened the discharge folder at the kitchen table. Inside were the hospital forms, the pediatric instructions, the compliance contact card, and a copy of the written restriction showing that no one but me had authority over discharge or newborn records. Behind those papers was Marisol's note, clipped neatly to the back. Do not answer them today. Building access is locked. Legal preservation letters go out this evening. Rest. That was the financial collapse in its earliest and most meaningful form. Not a dramatic courtroom loss, but the closing of every route my mother had tried to turn into control. No access to the hospital. No access to the condo. No access to records. No way to convert family status into procedural power. By the end of the week, Marisol would send formal notices regarding impersonation, interference, and attempted unauthorized access. My mother would have to hire counsel if she wanted to keep pretending none of it had happened. And even that would not return what she had lost. The social collapse had already moved faster. Celia was not the only one who had stopped repeating Lorraine's version of events. 2 cousins sent careful texts that evening, asking whether I needed groceries dropped off. One of them, who had ignored me for months because my mother always reached people first, wrote only this: I'm sorry I listened to the wrong person. Tessa did not text at all. That silence told its own story. She had been willing to stand beside my mother while the plan looked inevitable. She had nothing useful to say once the structure stopped obeying them. And the emotional shift came where I had hoped it would. In the smallest part of the evening, around midnight, I changed my son's diaper under the soft lamp beside the rocking chair and reached automatically for the feeding notebook. My hands were tired, my body hurt, and the room smelled faintly of milk and clean cotton. I wrote down the time, how long he ate, and the brief note that he had fallen asleep with one hand curled around my finger. Then I looked at the page and realized what had changed. Nothing in that room belonged to their version anymore. Not the routine, not the records, not the first night, not the shape of who I was in it. They had tried to take the authorship of these early days by making me look too unstable to hold them. Instead, every system that mattered had written the opposite. Mother. Authorized. Sole owner. Patient only. By morning, sunlight reached across the nursery floor and touched the edge of the bassinet. My son made a small sound in his sleep and turned his face toward the warmth. I stood over him in the quiet house and understood something that did not need to be said aloud to anyone. My mother had mistaken access for importance. She had thought that if she could position herself inside the paperwork, the doors, the routines, and the first decisions, she could become the structure around my child's life. She was wrong. I was the structure. I had been the one carrying him, planning for him, protecting him, and building the home he entered. The paperwork only caught up to what was already true. So I did not call Lorraine. I did not answer Tessa. I did not draft a statement for the family or explain myself to people who had watched too long before asking questions. I fed my son. I locked the door. I followed the schedule the pediatric nurse had given me. I let Marisol's letters go out. I let the building deny every future request without checking with me twice. And when the next week began, the truth of that hospital morning had already changed shape. It was no longer the story of a mother trying to give my child to my sister. It was the story of the day she finally discovered that I could not be replaced, not in the system, not in my home, and not in my son's life. By then, I no longer needed to argue it. Everything that mattered was already in my name.